I was on a hike last summer while on vacation. The hike was a spur-of-the-moment decision after I had to scrap one of my other plans for that day. There wasn't much to see in the way of scenery where I was. It was mostly flat and wooded. However, I went outside because I had nothing else to do. It seemed a little out of the ordinary to me that there were so many sides trails off of this main one. Small and frail, they appeared to have been hastily produced by a handful of people looking to cut corners. However, I was particularly interested in one of these options. It veered off in a direction that wasn't the main trail, and judging by the surroundings, I couldn't think of a single reason why anyone would take that detour. I squinted as far as I could, but the trees in the woods were too close together, my need to know one out, and I followed it to see what lay at its end. I guessed it led to a pond or someplace mildly interesting, but anything was preferable to the path I had been on before. It took me much longer than I had anticipated, about 15 minutes, to reach the destination. There was nothing but grass and trees as it ended. After proceeding past the terminus a short distance, I noticed a cabin nestled in the thick of the forest. Moss was growing on the wood, and the ceiling looked like it might collapse at any moment. I walked up to the entrance and noticed the door was gone, but the trees were blocking most of the light, so I couldn't see what was inside. A couple more steps brought me right up to the threshold of the door. It was still very dark, but I could make out broken furniture and splintered planks of wood strewn about the floor. I walked further inside while holding up my phone to provide a semblance of illumination. One door in the middle of the corridor was cracked open, and the other two rooms were mostly empty apart from the debris. When I peered inside, I noticed a set of stairs going down about a dozen or so levels to a cellar. It was eerie and terrifying, like something out of a horror film, but I didn't think there was any real danger there because the cabin was empty and abandoned. When I got to the bottom, I could smell what must have been a rat infestation. I pointed my phone in the direction of the door and saw that the room was tiny, about the size of a rickety old walk-in closet. But there was another door, this one on the wall and only half open. The light from my phone just barely peeked through the crack, but I could make out that it led to a long tunnel. I couldn't bring myself to take even one more step inside, so I just stood and looked. From where I was standing, I could only see a short distance into the tunnel, but even that short distance revealed that it was poorly constructed and beginning to crumble. After that, there was only pitch blackness. My anxiety was beginning to rise, and I finally had enough. As I retreated up the stairs, the light from my phone caught the eyes of a figure standing in the far corner of the room under the stairwell. I ran up the stairs too quickly, stumbling over the treads, overcome with panic. I didn't slow down until I was safely back in my car and driving out of the woods, having fled the cabin without so much as a glance back. The image of their eyes shining just a few feet from me in that pitch-black basement still gives me nightmares, and I have no idea who it was or why they were there. My family has owned a cabin for decades, and I spent the winter there this past year. It's a tiny cabin with only 2 bedrooms, and it's out in the middle of nowhere, but the whole family loves to spend their vacations there. Well, water required a manual pump, and there was only an outhouse across the yard, so I never really considered staying there. The only reason I stayed there the first time was because I needed a place to get away from it all for a few days, and didn't have enough money to rent a cabin of my own. I had no idea how isolated it would be until I got there. Although I anticipated a long journey, I was unprepared for how isolated this cabin felt. To get inside, I used the family key and parked the car outside, then turned on the generator. The fact that it was free made me feel like I couldn't complain about how good it was. I made sure there was nothing wrong with the place and got everything set up the way I wanted. I brewed a cup of tea and worked on my laptop in front of the fire. There was no reception this far out, but I brought some enjoyable distractions with me. I had no idea how much time had passed, but by the time it was dark out, I had everything put away and was prepared for bed. Before going outside to shut off the generator and save some gas, I noticed a glow in the distance. It stood out because it was the only source of light for miles around the cabin. I followed it as it made its way through the forest until it finally faded out of sight. I checked the area for any signs of it for a few more minutes before heading back inside, knowing that someone was so close by while holed up in a cabin a mile from the nearest town was unsettling. I extinguished the fire, walked to the bedroom under the light of the battery-operated lamp, and promptly fell asleep. I got up at first light, brewed some coffee, and stayed in the cabin until lunchtime when I went for a stroll outside. Because I was curious about the source of the light I had seen the night before, I headed in the direction it had come from. It took me about 20 minutes to get where I thought it was, but when I got there, I saw no signs of other people and no evidence of a walking path. Once I had finished exploring, I returned to my cabin and continued with my day. The same things I did yesterday, including lighting the fireplace, I did today. I went out to the generator as I was getting ready for bed, and once again, there was that glow. This time, however, it was still in the same place I'd seen it the night before. It had stopped moving and was glowing off in the distance in the woods. I stood there for a minute, but it didn't budge or even flicker, so I went inside and was fast asleep an hour later. However, I awoke in the middle of the night. Even though I was sleepy and groggy, I had to go to the bathroom. I stayed in bed as long as I could, hoping the discomfort would go away, but eventually gave up. I threw on some clothes and shoes, fetched the portable light, and headed for the outhouse. After I finished, I returned home via the yard and noticed footprints in front of one of the windows. After a closer inspection, I realized they were not my own. Then I noticed the order of their steps. After circling the cabin once, they decided to take a different route. Although I had no intention of following them out of the cabin, I couldn't help but notice that the direction they were heading in coincided with the spot in the woods where I had seen the lights moments before. When my stomach dropped, I bolted for the cabin, gathered my belongings, and left in the dark, without turning around to look back. I doubt I'll ever find out what happened in the cabin that night, and I'm not sure I want to. Last year, while on a road trip, I slept at an Airbnb for one night. The location, a log house in the woods, was the midpoint of my journey, and I intended to spend only one night there before continuing. It was almost dusk when I got there. After traveling for a few minutes along a lengthy gravel road, I finally arrived at the cabin. The driveway up to the front door was a tiny gravel path that had turned to mud from recent rainfall, and the house itself appeared older than I had anticipated. After dragging my suitcases inside, I looked around. There were so few windows that the room was pitch black even when the sun was partially up. I switched on a light, but it turned out to be the only one in the cabin that functioned. Already dissatisfied with my stay, I texted the host to see if perhaps I had forgotten to turn on a light. I tried not to worry too much because it was only for one night. I left my belongings in the bedroom and went to relax on a sofa in the living room. Even if the furnishings were hopelessly out of date, the place felt warm and welcoming. I had just pulled out my phone to begin mapping out the second half of tomorrow's drive when the doorbell rang. They knocked so loudly that I was more annoyed than baffled. Since there was no reason to check outside before opening the door, I did so. A man, dressed for the cold weather but sporting a broad grin, stood on the porch. There was a light breeze, but a heavy winter coat was unnecessary. In any case, he introduced himself as the host and offered to assist me with the lighting. I wasn't thrilled with his sneaky descent, and I didn't even much care about the lights, but since he was already here, I allowed him to pitch in. He strode into the living area and approached one of the lamps, at which he promptly began fiddling. While he was doing that, I went to check the driveway and noticed that it was empty. Considering how remote this location is, he must have driven here shortly after I texted him. When I turned around to inquire further, the host was already staring at me. The two of us stared at each other for a time in silence until the man broke the ice by apologizing and said he just couldn't figure it out, to which I said, "Don't worry about it. I have to get to bed soon anyhow," and made room for him to exit. He walked out of the cabin slowly and didn't say a word. It was all quite strange, and I was curious as to how he had managed to arrive without a vehicle, so I kept an eye on him. He walked quite a distance down the gravel road as if he were going to keep going, but eventually he turned around. As the man stood there staring at the cabin, I looked away, hoping he didn't notice me. After entering the woods, he walked off the gravel path. I didn't know what to make of what had just happened, but it didn't seem good to watch the host, suited for the outdoors, make his way into the woodland. There was a loud tap on my door again, so I stayed up for another 20 minutes on my phone, periodically checking the windows. It was too dark for anyone to be arriving, yet I was convinced it was the host. They repeated their aggressive knocking. I was at a loss for words, so I said nothing. I heard him leave the cabin and stroll around to the side a minute later. I cautiously entered the bedroom and turned on my phone's light. I waited for them to approach the window, and then I heard them halt. I waited silently with my light shining at the window for them to enter my field of vision. They then started to walk away after turning around. When they got too far away to hear me, I hurriedly packed my belongings and headed for my car. I drove the 6 kilometers to the closest gas station and then dialed 911 since I was unfamiliar with the situation. I decided to play it safe rather than risk getting hurt. I was terrified to learn that the police had called the Airbnb host and that it was someone other than the man who had visited. Even more terrifying is the fact that they have no idea who the other man is or why he is there. Upon concluding the brief investigation, the following morning, I resumed my journey. However, while on the road, a question arose that has since plagued my mind. How did the man know the lights weren't working if he wasn't the host, as I had texted him to inquire? Perhaps he had damaged the lamps himself before I arrived as part of a plot to gain my trust, or perhaps he was acting in tandem with the host. But whatever they were planning, I'm very sure I wouldn't be here today if I'd stayed in that cabin.